Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Regina Yao, and I'm the founder and president of the Pixel Project. And I'm moderating the 12th and final YouTube session of the 7th fall edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. So through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 12 award-winning best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking, especially in these troubled times. And we'll be telling you more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later. But for now, you can also go find out about what we do and how to stop violence against women by visiting www.thepixelproject.net. Today, we have a very special guest for our live Read for Pixels discussion and Q&A session. It's the award-winning science fiction and fantasy YA author Sam J. Miller. And Sam is the Nebula Award-winning author of The Art of Starving, which was selected as an NPR Best of the Year, and Blackfish City, a Best Book of the Year for Vulture, the Washington Post, Barnes & Noble, and more, and a recipient of the Shirley Jackson Award and a graduate of the Clarion Writers Workshop. Sam's work has also been nominated for the World Fantasy Theodore Sturgeon, John W. Campbell, and Locus Awards, and reprinted in dozens of anthologies. A community organizer by day, he lives in New York City. And so Sam has also generously donated some awesome goodies to the stash of treats that we have up as perks for US-based donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. And the first one, goodie number one, is a signed and personalized first edition hardcover of Sam's latest YA book, Destroy All Monsters. There are only 7 copies of this personalized edition of the book. Actually, there are only 6 now because we have a donor who donated to get it. It's Sarah Gaida. Thank you, Sarah, for being a long-term donor and for donating to get this really awesome book. Now, here's the reason why Sarah donated to get it, not just to support us, but also because Sam won't just sign and personalize your copy with some kind words. He will also hand draw your choice of dinosaur as part of making the book uniquely for you. And the best part is you can choose your dinosaur. So Sarah has already chosen her dinosaur, and she's really excited about it. So if you love dinosaurs and you want to support us and you want something really unique, please, you can go, and if you're in the US, please donate to get a copy of Destroy All Monsters. Now, goodie number 2 is a little more exclusive. It's a Destroy All Monsters book and art bundle. Now, this one includes, signed and personalized first edition hardcover of Destroy All Monsters, and you will, of course, get your dinosaur of choice along with the kind words in the book. But Sam will also add in 2 other things for you. One is the original digital illustration of a cartoon of an animal of your choice, of the donor's choice. So besides dinosaurs, you can also pick a more modern animal, something that's still around, or you can have more dinosaurs. Sam will do the drawings. And Sam will also do a handwritten letter for the donor's eyes only. Now, I'm going to say this is a great way if you have an LGBTQIA teen at home. This is a great way to have an author write to them some kind and encouraging words during the pandemic, because this is a really tough time for everybody. But even if your teen isn't LGBTQIA, it's always nice to hear from a YA author like Sam, because kids are having it tough too, going back to school when everything is so uncertain, or being stuck online and go for online schooling. So this will be a nice birthday present, or just a nice encouragement present if you donate to get this. But again, it's only for donors in the US, and there are only 3 of these exclusive bundles available. And so we have raised $2,915 towards our $5,000 goal so far. And fundraising has been predictably going really slowly this time around. Usually by this time we would have zoomed past 5,000, but we know that times are hard. But please give generously before the fundraiser ends on the 18th of October 2020. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help stop violence against women, including programs like Read for Pixels and our daily Twitter helpline retweet session. We tweet out helplines for women and girls in over 30 countries worldwide every evening from 8 p.m. Eastern Time all the way to midnight Eastern Time. So help us keep all this alive and kicking. So if you're watching this session on YouTube right now, you will also be able to ask Sam questions live. So just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the YouTube screen. And Xiaoqin and Denisha, who are today's producers and chat box moderators, will relay them to me to read out to Sam to answer. And now over to Sam. Welcome to Read for Pixels, Sam. What will you be reading for us today?
Hi, everybody. Good night or good morning, wherever you are. I will be reading from my second young adult novel, Destroy All Monsters. And I will be reading a scene from the end. It's kind of a spoiler because it's the scene where Ash, the young woman at the center of the story, confronts the man who was her best friend's stepfather, who she knows sexually molested him and possibly was abusive towards his mother. So I'm going to read the confrontation scene. A slight trigger warning. There's a mention of child molestation. There's no graphic representation of it. It's not discussed in any detail, but it's mentioned. So that is the trigger warning. If that's something that is a challenge, put me on mute for the next 10 minutes. Although actually it's quite early in the segment. So in this scene, Ash has gone to her friend Connor's house. Connor is her boyfriend, and his father is Mr. Barrett, who is the abuser of Ash's best friend, Solomon. And so she's gone to visit Connor, and she's hoping she doesn't have to run into Mr. Barrett. We slipped into the house silently and made our way upstairs. Connor went to work, sloppily stuffing shirts and pants into a duffel bag. I stood in the hallway, watched Mr. Barrett's bedroom door, prayed it wouldn't open. And then it did. And there he was, struggling into his fancy clothes for the Halloween dance. Bleary-eyed, like maybe he hadn't slept so well, but otherwise the same. Strong, broad, scary shoulders, muscled arms. He could hurt us if he wanted to. Ash, he said, and a shiver went through me, and nausea, and rage. You broke him, I thought. What's the matter, he said. Why are you standing in the dark? The next breath would not come. Hey, he said, and reached out his hand and touched my forearm. And he wasn't trying to hurt me. He had no reason to. He had no idea how much I hated him, how much I knew. And my brain knew that, but my body reacted, tapped into something, some skill from somewhere else entirely, and my arms moved fast as lightning, grabbing his wrist with one hand and his elbow with the other, and twisting, bending his arm a way it should never go, bringing the big, strong man to his knees with a yelp of pain and surprise. Hell of a move, he laughed. Don't talk to me, I said, whispering, praying Connor would not come out of his room. Now he laughed. What happened, Ash? I didn't mean to say anything. I knew the smart thing was to get the heck out of there without risking a confrontation. Let the wheels of justice handle Mr. Barrett. But part of me didn't trust those wheels. And even if anything came of my parents' attempts to hold him accountable, it would arrive in the form of legal papers, a phone call, something that would give him plenty of time to put on a brave face, lie his way through it. I wanted to see his face. I wanted to see the fear flicker in his eyes. I know, I hissed, what you did to Solomon. Solomon has a serious mental illness, he said, shaking his head with false sadness, and you're not helping him if you indulge these persecution fantasies. I saw you, I said, the day I fell from your treehouse. I saw you sexually assault him. His face went blank for just a fraction of a second. His eyes twitched. If any fear flickered there, it was only for a split second. And then he laughed. What, you've known this whole time? Or let me guess, you've suddenly regained your memories magically? He laughed again, and I stopped myself from twisting his wrist and elbow again, further, harder this time, and breaking his arm. I don't doubt that you believe what you're saying, Ash. You're worried about your friend, and your brain has manufactured a narrative where I'm the bad guy and Solomon is. It's not manufactured, I said, and there will be a reckoning. More laughter. More barely stifled urge to shatter his bones. Oh, my dear Ash, he said, you have been watching entirely too many movies. Nobody who knows me would ever believe whatever story you've concocted, and everyone in this town knows me. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Nausea closed up my throat. I'd been an idiot to believe I could break him with a weapon as flimsy as the truth. He had confidence, arrogance, a mighty armor made of toxic masculinity. I felt sick. I felt helpless. I'd imagined I could destroy him, but I'd misjudged where his power came from, how deep his sickness ran. He'd refused to see how he was a bad person. He let me stand there, sputtering, for something to say, enjoying the sight of how angry I was, how impotent. And then a door creaked open behind me. Hey, Dad, Connor said. Mr. Barrett's jaw dropped. This time, I saw the fear in his eyes. Real fear, raw and thick. I could smell it. The scent of guilt, of shame. You told him that we know, Connor said to me. Mr. Barrett took a step forward. Connor, you understand this is nonsense, he said, but I could hear his confidence deflating fast. You said no one would believe me, I interrupted, his pleading. But Connor does. Connor knows. Connor knows everything. Mr. Barrett's eyes went wider than I'd ever seen them. His face tightened, then crumpled. I could see the struggle in his face over how to respond. To trivialize, to threaten, to humiliate, to beg, to attack me, to call me a liar, to call Solomon crazy, to say it was all a work of imagination, all lies, all a conspiracy. But I also saw him realize that it would not do any good. Connor believed. Connor knew what a monster he was. His walls fell down. Mr. Barrett's armor melted away. All the metaphors failed him. Confidence, arrogance, toxic masculinity, none of it could shield him from the pain of having his son understand exactly what a monster he was. Connor didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His eyes did all the talking, and what smoldered there was raw hate, contempt, revulsion. Mr. Barrett took a step back, as if physically feeling the force of his son's disgust. Connor saw him for what he really was, and for the first time, so did Mr. Barrett. The mirror his son held up to him, the pure power of his loathing, showed Mr. Barrett the monster he'd spent so long pretending he wasn't. I could see it hit home, saw his eyes fill up with tears. And even if nothing happened, even if he never went to jail, even if no cop ever slapped cuffs on him, even if the rest of the town never discovered what a monster he was, I knew that this was what mattered. Connor mattered. His son mattered. And his son hated him. Who else? Connor asked. Mr. Barrett didn't budge or speak. So much passed between their eyes in that instant. The balance of power between father and son had been forever shifted. He might never go to jail for it, but Mr. Barrett's monstrous actions had cost him the most important thing in his life. Who else did you hurt like that? Connor was shouting now. Mr. Barrett stammered, Connor, I, but he was all out of words. You're a monster, Connor said. He shouldered his duffel bag and headed for the steps. Ash, Mr. Barrett said to me, his mouth slack, his face shattered. It was what I'd prayed for, the unbreakable monster broken. But whatever pride or victory or happiness I had hoped to feel was dwarfed by Connor's pain. I followed him down the stairs and out into the cool dark.
All right, that's a great into what we're going to discuss, including toxic masculinity later on. So your books. So let's get started with the questions. Your books feature multifaceted female characters such as Masarat, the Cancer in Blackfish and Ash, are all monsters and who are complex, compelling, very human characters with very distinct. So what are your inspirations for your
Who are my
female
inspirations?
Yeah, who or what are your inspirations for
I
your
think
female
I
characters?
read a lot, and there are so many great writers out there who are writing these powerful, compelling, amazing characters and stories. So my favorite science fiction writer is Octavia Butler, and she she wrote books like Kindred and Mind of My Mind, which is my favorite science fiction novel, and The Parable of the Talents and The Parable of the Sower. And she has an incredible knack for drawing powerful female characters who who live in worlds that are very similar to ours, that are full of racism and misogyny and patriarchy and oppression, and who manage to fight back and deal with really horrific problems, but fight back and win. And there's many writers like that. I love Holly Black. I love Cassandra Clare. I love Jacqueline Woodson. And so there are plenty of writers who I love who have inspired me for how to tell those stories. But throughout my life, I've been very privileged to know and work with so many incredible, strong women, from my mom to some of my community organizing mentors, people who, many of whom have to, deal with all sorts of really intense problems and still bring so much strength and positivity and inspiration and manage to, fight demons. And whether those demons are the literary demons in a book or the actual demons of racism and violence against women and patriarchy and white supremacy, those are the, I'm fortunate to have all those strong women in my lives, whether they are fictional or literary or real.
And all genres, including science fiction and fantasy, have their share of female stereotypes and tropes, which many authors fall back on, whether or not it's subconscious or conscious, or conscious choice. However, you seem to navigate and subvert these tropes with ease. For example, in both Blackfish City and Destroy All Monsters, the story is catalyzed or driven by a powerful and proactive female character. In Blackfish City, Mazarat's arrival in the city sets off a complex web of changes and consequences, not because she died, not because she was rich, but just by virtue of her arrival. And Ash is a teenage photographer who sets out to rescue not just herself, but her friend, Solomon, a boy named Solomon. So it's a reversal of, the damsel in distress trope. So how do you break stereotypes and subvert tropes? Create a female character agency while dealing with the world around her, including sexism, misogyny, and violence against women, especially those who do not fit into culturally prescribed gender norms.
Well, That's very kind of you. Thank you. That means a lot to hear that they work on that level and they don't feel stereotypical or like familiar tropes, because that's a huge goal of mine. I think most writers don't want to be stereotypical. They don't want to fall back on old tropes. And that's just generally true, right? Like that's true with general storytelling tropes of, don't have a twist that everyone has seen 1,000 times. Don't have the ending that someone has already read, or like the ending is the same as the Lord of the Rings or whatever. So, writers really want to be, the good ones anyway, want to be inventive and original and tell fresh stories. But that goes triple when we're talking about things like where the tropes map onto harmful stereotypes and problems. So, it's bad enough to tell a familiar and boring story we've already heard 1,000 times about, a straight white guy. But if you're telling one about a woman of color, it's 1,000 times worse, because that's oppression that is in the real world, and that is, you're sort of echoing what the world has already done. So, I part of that just has to do with, reading really widely and really trying to be aware of what the problems are, what the tropes are, what the traps are, so they don't fall into them. I am a huge believer in writers existing in community and having friends, having writers groups, having other people that you trust and admire who can read your stuff and give you feedback, and who you can read their stuff and give them feedback. And so I have always been very blessed to have writers, including many women writers. I'm in a writers group in New York City called Altered Fluid that includes amazing writers like N.K. Jemisin and Elia Dawn Johnson and Alyssa Wong, and tons of others who I have learned so much from, and who, both in terms of reading their work, but also getting the benefit of their critiques. So as writers, we have to sort of hold two contradictory ideas in our head at all times. On the one hand, you have to feel like, I'm good. I'm so good that I want to put my words out into the world and expect people to read them. I'm so good that trees should be cut down to print the books that my words will be in, right? When you send your book to a publisher, that's what you're saying is like, you should cut down some trees for my words. So you have to be pretty, I don't want to say arrogant, but you have to be confident in your abilities on the one hand. And on the other hand, you also have to know that you're not that great, that you still have a long way to go, that you have a lot to learn, that you might be good. Yeah, maybe you have some skill, but you can always get better, and you should always be trying to get better. And for me, the most effective way to do that is to exist in community with other writers and to learn from them and to share what you have with them. And that makes everyone stronger.
Yeah, that pretty much goes against a piece of writing advice I was given by someone who's a very big name, who shall not be named, who said that, don't listen to other people, just write what you want.
It's on a certain level, to be a writer, you have to ignore some people who are going to say, can you really make a living like that? That you should do, everyone's going to try to tell you what you should do. So you should know what you want to do, but that's not the same as ignoring other people, especially people who maybe know what they're talking about. Ignore people who don't know what they're talking about, but know who does know what they're talking about, so that you can pay attention to them.
Yeah. And speaking about that, as we can see from the cringe-inducing hashtag men writing women, many male authors can't write male characters to save their lives. Even huge best-selling male authors such as Brandon Sanderson have talked about how they initially found it difficult to write women well, and that it took a lot of work to finally write great female characters. And Brandon is a Refa Pixels author, and when he had a session with us, he actually talked about this extensively. So as a male author yourself, did you find it difficult to write women when you first started writing a story?
I think I find it difficult to write everyone, including people who are the same gender as me. And of course, the more different someone's experience is from your own, the more challenging it can be, and the more careful you have to be to not make a mistake with someone else's experience. So I wouldn't say that it was easy, but I will say that the rule that I've always approached with all of my characters, whether they are male, female, gender non-binary, is that they're people. And if you treat them with respect, if you treat them with, if you give them agency and the ability to make decisions that will impact the plot, then you will, then they can, then at the very least, they will not feel like cardboard cutouts that have been inserted into the story to say some lines or have something happen to them. But that, it's still, it's always possible to get something wrong, to make a mistake, to say something that is hurtful or problematic in a way that you don't understand or don't realize. So I always want to proceed with extreme caution, but I also want to understand and appreciate that everyone's experience is different, and no two, like I'm a gay white guy, no two gay white guys have the same way of thinking about things. And so I could write something that is true to my experience that another person who is very like me will say, no, that's not real. That's whatever. So, there's going to be a certain room for people to say that's not real. And as long as you've given people agency and treated them with respect, and have done the kind of homework to hear from and listen to and read a lot from, if you're writing women, you should be reading a lot of women. If you're writing trans folks, you should be reading a lot of trans folks. You should just read really widely and listen to and pay attention to these conversations that are happening, especially now that we're in this moment where after, years and years of publishing being so straight and white and male and US centered, we're now seeing all these amazing writers who are from so many diverse backgrounds, who are not only publishing amazing stories, but who are, thanks to Twitter, thanks to social media, they're able to sort of like share their truth in a way that wasn't the case before. And that has sort of undercut the monopoly that straight white men have had on who gets to, give the awards, decide who is quality, who gets a TV show made, all this stuff. So it's an exciting time if you're open to and embracing and passionate about committing to social change.
Yeah, and why do you think many authors still have trouble writing stories, while many male authors still have trouble writing stories that pass the Bechdel test, despite the fact that there are many more things that women talk about other than men? I can tell you now that my daily conversation with people does involve, talking about men.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, a lot of that, like, I don't want to oversimplify, but a lot of that is just like many writers are not great, or that there's like a very formulaic, easy way of doing it, and that many writers have, are ignorant or have a lot of blocks in terms of what they understand and know about how story works. And so, yeah, the idea that this is a problem that has happened throughout. Whenever men tell stories about women, they can't take themselves out of the picture. So yeah, I think that a lot of that has to do with writers who aren't able to read widely and experience and be open to what other people are saying. And there's so much great stuff happening. And if you're not reading N.K. Jemisin, if you're not reading Anne Leckie, Nnedi Okorafor, all these amazing writers who are changing the game, Carmen Maria Machado, there's so much out there. And I think that if, a lot of writers, especially but not exclusively men, need to be reading a lot more widely.
Yeah, and I would just like to mention an extreme case here that someone was telling me about, that this man handed her his manuscript and said, could you read it and give me some feedback? And she discovered that he had no women in his book. And when she talked to him about it, he said that he didn't realize, one, he didn't realize that he did not have any women. And number two, he said he figured that it's probably because he doesn't understand women.
I mean, I don't understand how you're going to write if you're going to say I don't understand 50% of the world, why are you writing? I mean, yeah, of course you're writing fiction for other men, but you have to acknowledge that that's you're limiting yourself. You're limiting your readership, and you're telling truths that are not that are stale, that are rooted in ignorance. You know, there's this like not every story has to be about everything, and I'm sure if I I could think about stories that I have loved that have just had male characters. That's not the kind of story that I typically want to tell, but it's one thing to sort of like not every story needs to address everything, but if you're as a policy not addressing that, then I think your work really suffers. There's the American author Jonathan Franzen, who's been sort of celebrated as like the great American novelist, whose books have been really celebrated as sort of the mainstream literary fiction ideal. Who writes about American families and the American experience. And someone asked him, like, why don't you have any Black people in your story? If you're writing about America, how can you not have Black people in your stories? That's like essential to the American experience. Even if you're only writing about white characters, you can't tell the story of America without telling the story of people of color, especially African Americans. And he said something like, "Well, that's not my experience. That's not what I'm familiar with." And so, if you don't understand how the story of Black people in America is the story of white people in America, then you can't tell the story of America. And I think that's true of male writers who say I don't understand women or I can't tell female stories. Well, you can't tell male stories then because you don't truly understand how the world works. You don't truly understand gender oppression. You don't understand misogyny. So whatever truth you're telling, you might find readers for it. There will probably be other men who will resonate with it, but you're not telling the truth.
Yeah, and I have free words for those male writers about women. We are people too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So moving forward, as some of your female characters may be perceived by readers as quote unquote unlikable simply because they are no nonsense, powerful, or just don't give a fig about what others think about them. So when writing female characters, do you ever feel pressured by gender and cultural stereotypes to make them likable or relatable?
That's an interesting question because I actually feel pressure in general to make my characters likable, regardless of their gender. And I think that to a certain extent, that's a good thing. Like, not likable in the sense that they should conform to stereotypes and they should be good and pretty and obedient, whatever. But I remember I had a short story called 57 Reasons for the Slate Quarry Suicides. And this goes back to how being in a writer's group and having a community of writers makes you better. And in that story, which is about this young gay boy who has a superpower, this ability to control other people's bodies. So if he touches you on your skin, he can control your body. And he uses it to exact a terrifying vengeance against his bullies. But in my initial draft, he was learning how to use this power, and he practiced it on an animal, and he used it on a squirrel, and he killed the squirrel. And to me, I wasn't graphic about it. I didn't describe it, but it was something that happened of this kid who kills a squirrel. And one of my readers was horrified, and she said, like, this makes me hate this character, and this makes me not care about anything else he does. And so on the one hand, I do want to be careful of making sure that characters don't do things that will make readers hate them, and not do things that are offensive or problematic, that echo biases or oppression in the real world. So that I think is a good pressure. It's a good pressure to make sure that your characters aren't monsters, aren't jerks, aren't abusers, whatever. As far as making characters conform to a certain idea of gender behavior, that I don't feel any pressure to. And I love, as a reader, as a viewer of television and movies, I love the characters who break that and who don't behave the way they're supposed to. When I feel like, whether it's a really macho dude or a really docile and obedient woman, whenever I feel like the character is behaving too much in a gendered way, I tend to get very bored and not super interested. And that's why a lot of stories, books, movies don't do much for me. It's when they start to twist that. It's when the men, show vulnerability and weakness and submissiveness, whatever kinds of like problematically gendered behaviors are typically attributed to women. That's when I get excited. Just like that's when I get excited when a woman character, just starts killing people or starts, beating up the bad guys, or starts, walks into a room and is the smartest character in the room and tells the know-it-all men, like, no, this is how you kill the alien. That's not going to work. That's just going to make the alien stronger. So yeah, I want my characters to be just unlikable enough.
Okay, so you just described Shuri.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Like one of the things that there's so many things that I loved about Black Panther, but that character and the idea that a teenage girl can, be the one, like don't tell anybody, don't put this on the internet. But I've often had a problem with Marvel movies. I have not really gotten super excited about them. And often that's because of the sort of Iron Man, Tony Stark, like, I'm the smart dude, you guys are dumb. Like, that does very little for me. Like, I'd never liked Iron Man as a character. And the fact that Shuri has many of those traits of that cockiness, that confidence, that, that brilliance, like that I love. And so, yeah, it's because it's it's inverting the stereotype. It's giving you something fresh and new in a way that makes me excited about it.
Yeah, and that moment when she one-ups Bruce Banner, that was when thousands of girls around the world started cheering. And when she referred to white guys, hello colonizer, that was when thousands of around the world in post-colonial countries started going, yes.
Yeah, like those are the stories that I want to tell. Those are the stories that I want to read and watch. Is the people who are like, like, no colonizer, like, like I historically have not had gotten too into steampunk, and a lot of that is because a lot of times steampunk fetishizes the Victorian age and the sort of like British explorer industrialist narrative, which, as we know from history, it was deeply problematic and you can't tell that story without telling the story of like the conquest of Asia, South Asia, Africa. One of my favorite books of recent years is Nisi Shaw's Everfair, which is sort of like the counter narrative to that. And she's a African American author who sort of wrote a story about like, if like an African steampunk story about how King Leopold and the British and European colonizers got beat, and how actually, like, the nations that we in the real world think of as colonized were able to sort of like attain the kind of empire and greatness and conquest, and not conquest, but were able to develop without the oppression and exploitation that they dealt with historically at the hands of the British and other European colonizers.
Yeah. Okay, so to get back on track, some female authors have talked about getting flack for not making a female character likable enough. We've heard from, we've worked with over 150 authors now over the last almost 8 years, and we have heard this every now and then. So as a male author, do you encounter the same type of pushback?
For one thing, I'm very careful not to read the Goodreads reviews or the Amazon reviews, or a lot of the places that I know a lot of the sort of like more conservative readers go to discuss stuff and often to share opinions like that. So not to say that I don't encounter stuff like that. One thing that I have encountered that I think is similar but not the same is that my stories are very gay, and they center gay characters and queer characters and LGBT characters, and I've had many a experience of I had a short story called "We Are the Cloud," which is about two boys in foster care, teenage boys falling in love and betraying one another in foster care in a future New York City. And I had reviewers who called it pornographic, even though there wasn't, it wasn't super graphic representation of sex. It was just the fact that I was talking about male characters being intimate was offensive, was pornographic to people. So I think that the similar thing is that probably the same reviewers, probably the same people who say I want my women to be more likable are the ones who are saying I don't want gay people in my stories. So I think it's a similar thing of the sort of more conservative, more right wing, more male patriarchal readers who don't want to have to hear about anything other than straight white men having sex with women or avenging their murdered woman or rescuing their kidnapped wife or whatever kind of like story you've heard 1,000 times. So I do feel like I've gotten similar pushback. And it's possible that I've gotten that pushback of people who didn't like some of the things that Ash or other women in my stories have done, but I've been able to sort of like block those voices out. Knock on wood.
Yeah. All right, so before we continue with our discussion, there is a question from the audience from one of our longtime viewers, Misty306. So Misty asks, both you and Rebecca Roanhorse, who is also a Read for Pixels author, wrote stories about the realistic possibilities about the consequences of the ice caps melting. Why did you choose the Arctic Circle as a setting in Blackfish City? I mean, Rebecca's books are awesome, and she picked a very different milieu to lay out her story. So why did you pick the Arctic Circle?
Well, thank you, Misty, for that question. And I am obsessed with Rebecca's work. I love it. Trail of Lightning is one of my faves of the past few years, and she's a wonderful person who I've read with and I've gotten to meet at award shows and stuff. And so I just love her work so much. So I'm honored to be compared, to be mentioned in the same sentence as she. Why I chose the Arctic Circle. For one thing, I think that, climate change is something that I am really terrified about and take really seriously, and I'm really stressed out by. And so I'm always trying to imagine, I want to tell the stories that will freak people out enough that they will do something about climate change and that they will act to avert the sort of like climate apocalypse that I think is coming and that most science indicates is a likely scenario. And so, I think that, it's we're already seeing major melt in the Arctic, and one of the things that I think is a probably logical development that is already happening and that will intensify is that as the Arctic melts, it will open up for resource exploitation. And we're already seeing countries like Russia that are sort of like, trying to jockey for power in that region, in a region that hasn't historically, like no one's been fighting over the ice. Like it hasn't been a problem, but it's shaping up to be a problem. So I think it's a reasonable assumption that that's a possibility, that might happen. So, but to specifically why Blackfish City, I wrote a short story called Calved, which was published in Asimov's science fiction magazine in 2015. Because one of the things that as an American I see a lot in America, there's a ton of anti-immigrant sentiment, and there's so much hatred of immigrants. I'm married to an immigrant from the Dominican Republic, and I am, like many Americans, descended from immigrants. So I don't understand that, and I think that the really funny thing about anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States is that many of the immigrants who are coming to the United States from countries like from places like Latin America are coming to the United States because of the United States. Like the United States destroyed the Mexican economy with NAFTA and with U.S. companies sort of like ruthlessly destroying the economy there. And so because people can't make a living in their home country of Mexico, they come here because of things that we did, and then we want to abuse them for it. So I think that is just sort of like this irony of anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States, is that usually it's the US's fault that folks are coming here because of our actions historically. So I wanted to imagine a future where the foot is on the other shoe, and those same people like are, because American behavior has caused climate change or helped cause climate change or been a factor in climate change. Now we are the immigrants. Now we have been displaced. Now we are in other places where we are hated, and we who used to hate immigrants now have to deal with that same anti-immigrant sentiment. So that's where this floating city of Connacht first appeared, and that I would later explore in Blackfish City. That was a long answer, Misty. I'm sorry. Hope that wasn't too long.
All right. It's kind of reminds me of the cheesy movie A Day After Tomorrow, where it was immigration in reverse.
I love that. So it's funny you should say that, because I saw that movie in a crowded theater in New York City, and as you know, New York City is overwhelmingly immigrant. There are a ton of immigrants, and the scene where the Americans were trying to get into Mexico and they were stopped at the border, you never heard so much applause. Like the whole audience was cheering at the sight of anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican Americans being told, no, you can't come into our country. It was great.
All right.
I didn't love the movie, but it was worth it for that scene.
Okay. It was a great movie. So let's talk about male characters and masculinity in science fiction and fantasy. You mentioned the term toxic masculinity during your reading. It's actually embedded in your story, which Ash uses the term. So you have written male characters that are not typically seen in science fiction and fantasy, including Matt, a gay teen boy with an eating disorder in The Art of Starving, and Solomon, who deals with severe PTSD in Destroy All Monsters. Do you think, and this is a long question, so let's see if I get it right. So do you think reframing how stories portray men away from hostile and toxic stereotypes and towards complexity and even vulnerability can be one of the ways that science fiction and fantasy writers can break away from tropes that promote toxic masculinity and the dehumanization of women?
Yes, 100%. This is actually one of my obsessions as a writer. It's one of the things I keep revisiting, is this idea that men are harmed by toxic masculinity too. Men are harmed by patriarchy in 1,000 ways. And of course, we're here to talk about violence against women, and obviously, I don't want to say they're the same. Obviously, men benefit from patriarchy and misogyny and anti-woman oppression in a million ways. But it's also true that they are harmed by it and they are deformed by it. And I often feel like masculinity makes men into monsters. And so, on the one hand, yes, I do want to tell stories of gay boys with eating disorders, and people who have PTSD, and people who, men who, also have, problems, and who aren't the stereotypical strong man, who are strong in different ways, whose strength lies elsewhere than in physical strength and domination of others. So that is definitely something that is important to me. It's something I try to do over and over again. The other thing is I also think it's important to tell the other story of the toxic male who comes to realize how they have been harmed by toxic masculinity. So I mentioned my short story Calved, which was set in the city of Connacht, which is sort of like the prequel to Blackfish City. And the main character, the narrator of that is a straight guy from New York who has been displaced when New York was flooded because of rising sea levels. It ended up in this floating city in the Arctic, and he carries so many, I mentioned it's sort of like an inversion of the anti-immigrant tale of like, what if anti-immigrant people ended up being forced into immigration? So he carries many of the sort of biases and prejudices. He doesn't necessarily realize that, and he doesn't necessarily behave in an aggressive or jerkish fashion. But in the end of the story, he realizes that the assumptions he's made and the sort of like behavior that he internalized, the violence that he carried. I don't want to spoil it, so I won't tell you what happens. But his violence and his sort of like toxic masculinity costs him his relationship with his son, because he does something unforgivable that he thinks is doing. He's trying to like help his son, but he doesn't understand what his son is dealing with. So I think the two things are important. I want to tell the stories about men who are strong in other ways and who are vulnerable and who aren't macho jerks. But I also want to tell the story of macho jerks who come to realize that they are macho jerks and who come to realize that that the privilege that they had is a curse and has harmed them because they don't understand things. They don't understand their relationships with others, especially with women, because of the biases that they carry. So I want to tell both those stories.
And speaking of stories, we believe, and this is why we have the Read for Pixels program. So we believe that stories are one of the most powerful ways of bringing about social change. Historically, stories are how people pass their traditions and their cultures from one generation to another, especially, before writing was invented. But even now, a lot of cultures still pass their wisdom and their traditions and their cultures down orally. So let's talk about writing and genre. So in your opinion, how can authors strike a balance in their storytelling between raising awareness about issues like violence against women while telling an engaging story without being pedantic or preachy?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. The best advice I ever got on that was from Holly Black, the young adult writer. She was one of my instructors at the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Workshop. And she made this really brilliant and kind of challenging point, which is that if you want to write a story where you argue a political point, you almost have to argue the opposite. You have to give space to, like, if you want to write, like, for example, I wrote a story once about a woman who is an anti-abortion activist and who helps participate in a terrorist attack on an abortion clinic. And that's, rooted in my own sort of like, as a, vehement supporter of a woman's right to choose. That's something that I don't understand, is this sort of like the hatred of and the sort of aggressive attempts, especially by women, to make it impossible for other women to have reproductive freedom. And so I wanted to, in order to sort of explore that tension and sort of spotlight the inherent contradictions in that, I had to sort of like write from that perspective and give that character the space. So I was able to sort of better understand where someone like that was coming from by giving that character the respect and I mentioned before, giving people respect and giving them agency, even if you find them reprehensible or even if you think that they're dangerous or destructive. So part of that is just being open to being, I don't want to say even-handed, because I'm not someone who thinks that both sides need to be heard, right? It's like some issues, there is no other side. There's no other side to violence against women. There's no other explanation. I don't want to legitimize that, but being able to sort of like make a political point, while not treating the people who hold that belief like they are inherently monsters, even if I sometimes might feel like they are. So that to me is the key, is like treating that with respect. And of course, I always want to tell an engaging story. I always want to have fun. I always want to give you like exciting, fun, creepy, weird stuff. That's why I'm a science fiction and fantasy and horror writer, is because I like stories that are fun, and I like stories that are fun and make a point, but I want to have fun and I want the reader to have fun, because that's what's going to keep them reading and that's what's going to keep them listening. And I think that, one of my favorite TV shows is Avatar: The Last Airbender. And there's this character on that show called Sokka, who's a teenage boy, and his sister he has at the beginning of the show a lot of sort of chauvinistic beliefs, like he's the man. His father is off fighting a war, and his mother is dead. So he has a lot of ideas of like, I'm the man, and I need to take care of you, and that's tied up in a lot of like, you're weak, you're not able to take care of yourself, let alone me. And sort of like his journey in that story of like realizing that his sister's a badass and that she's really powerful, and that he has a lot to learn from, so I like it when we sort of like, while telling a fun and engaging story, also go on a journey of a character who grows from one belief to another.
Okay, so the line between consent and coercion isn't always very clear in science fiction and fantasy books. And certainly in some subgenres of fantasy, violence against women, especially rape, is still used to catalyze the male character's development or as a shorthand for showing how brutal the world is. Do you think this is an issue that writers in the genre have started tackling successfully in recent years?
I actually really do, and I've realized how I realized that there was this anxiety that I used to have that I've been able to let go of recently. Of like, of course, it still happens. Of course, it's very problematic that lots of writers still employ that use of sexual violence as a threat, as like a thing on the page to make you scared. And so that, of course, still happens. But many of the best writers who are out there, I can read them without fearing like, oh my God, is this woman character going to be put in an unspeakably awful situation? Is she going to be threatened where she's going to be reduced to a sex object? Whatever. Like there's so many writers who are challenging that and bucking that trend. And yes, fantasy especially has a well-deserved bad reputation for that. I think that even Game of Thrones, which I think in many ways has a lot of really strong, amazing women characters, still is this example of like a narrative that keeps on using rape as a plot point, as a point for a male or female character to develop. Like I think of like the storyline of Sansa Stark on Game of Thrones, where the sort of like repeated and different types of sexual brutality that she's subject to is used both to show how the men are evil and how she is so strong, like how she is so weak and vulnerable, and then how she becomes stronger. So I think it's still a thing, and I think that especially the more mainstream, the more big, the sort of bigger narratives like that, it's still a thing. But I read writers like N.K. Jemisin and others who are really challenging those sort of easy and cheap and harmful storytelling tropes in a way that I think make me less afraid. And so while I used to not read fantasy in large part because of things like that, I'm starting to feel more comfortable and less scared. I'm a big fan of the writer Marlon James, and that is something where I feel like there's I read the book of Night Women, and there's a lot of sexual violence in that, and his latest book has a lot of sexual violence against both men and women, and those are things that I have a real hard time with, and so often that's often like where I stop reading a book, unfortunately, even if a book is in many other ways well done. It's something that is often a deal breaker. And so, yeah, I'm glad to read so many writers now who are not doing that.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm gonna make some suggestions now, and so the audience will also be interested in this. The suggestion would be, here are a few, at Read for Pixels, we do very carefully decide who we would like to invite, as you can imagine. And here are, if you want to read fantasy books, especially urban fantasy, which treats the issue of violence against women with the gravity and the touch, the complex touch that it deserves, try reading the Soulwood series by Faith Hunter. It features the protagonist has escaped from a Christian cult in Tennessee, and throughout we look at her dealing with the fallout from that. And you can try Anne Bishop's very unique series called the others, the courtyard of the others. And I think you'll love it, Sam, because
Awesome.
it's all about climate change. It's also about respecting nature, but it also deals with human violence.
That's great. Those sound great. I will definitely check them out.
It may be triggering for some people, but it's also prescient. It's so prescient to the point where she even predicted the toilet paper rush.
Amazing. Wow.
Yeah. So Anne Bishop is amazing. If any of you have not read The Courtyard of the Others, please read it now. She's not a Read for Pixels author yet, but we really recommend her for anyone who wants to read how violence against women should be written.
And Faith Hunter was the other one you mentioned?
Yes, Faith Hunter is the Read for Pixels author. Soulwood is the one that folks should look at as to how to present and violence against women, the fallout from violence against women, but still tell a really, really great action-packed story. All right, so we've got a few minutes left, but let's talk about, we've been talking about social change through books. And speaking of that, your day job is working as a community organizer, and you have mentioned to us before this session and during this session that violence against women is an issue that's close to your heart because you do also provide domestic violence organizations with training in activist and organizational techniques. So how do you get started with this, and what are some of the techniques and strategies that you have taught domestic violence organizations?
Yeah, so just to be clear, I am actually not a community organizer anymore. I recently stopped. My organization that I worked for many years, called Picture the Homeless, was really struggling, and there wasn't the funds, unfortunately, to continue. But it's like community organizing is something I'm really passionate about. I think that while yes, as a storyteller, I want to create social change, we also live in the real world, and so I want to support activism and fighting to create change. And one of the things that my organization, Picture the Homeless, was really renowned for and celebrated for centering the experiences of directly impacted people. So we were founded by two homeless men who were living in a shelter in New York City, and we led, our board was always majority homeless. Most of our staff had experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. And we were all about like, if you're going to talk about homelessness in the media, you should not be interviewing the guy who got a PhD in homelessness. You should be interviewing the homeless person. Like the guy with a PhD who has never experienced homelessness doesn't necessarily know what the realities are in the same way that someone who's sleeping under a bridge or living in a shelter does. So because we had this reputation for making sure that people who were directly impacted by a problem were the spokespeople for it, and because we were dealing with a population that had been, so stigmatized and so had been dealing with so much oppression and violence and hardship, that many people said, oh, well, homeless people can't, like they're crazy, they're dealing with so much, they can't speak to the media, they can't be the ones to tell their own story, they can't be the ones to sit in a meeting with a government official and say, you need to implement this policy, you need to pass this law. And we said, no, that's not true. You might have to do more work, you might have to support people more, you might have to give people the prep. If someone's never met with an elected official before, I don't care if you're homeless or you're a millionaire, if you've never met with an elected official before, you might be intimidated, you might be overwhelmed, you might not know how to handle it, you might believe them when they lie to you, you might not know how to do it. So everyone needs that kind of prep. If you're being interviewed by the New York Times for the first time, whether you're homeless or you're a lawyer, if that's never happened to you, you need that kind of prep. So we put a real value on training people, prepping people. And so we were approached by a organization that is sort of an umbrella organization for domestic violence service providers in the United States, specifically because we did that and because we said, no, people can speak for themselves. And I think there had been a similar thing with, the domestic violence movement in the United States, where, it's a little different. The issues that domestic violence survivors even though there's a lot of overlap with homeless folks, a lot of homeless folks have experienced domestic violence or violence against women. The issues are not all the same. But there's a similar thing of like, we don't necessarily always think that people can speak for themselves. Oh, they don't want to go on camera. They've been made to feel so ashamed of what they've been through. And so a lot of the service providers, and we work with organizations that were on Indian reservations, that were in big cities, in small towns, in Alaska, in New York, all over the country. And so, many of them were dealing with similar things of like, we are providing services, we are helping, we run a shelter, we do this, we do that. But we want to change the system. We don't want to just provide services. It would be better if, women didn't deal with violence against women rather than, putting Band-Aids on it when they do deal with it. So they approached us and we started doing these trainings, and, because we had so many women, many of the women that I work with, the homeless women and formerly homeless women, a lot of them had experienced domestic violence or violence against women. And because we had this great leadership culture where people could speak for themselves and they could train each other, it was a great fit. And so we got the privilege of, for many years, providing service, providing this training for lots of folks and helping them how to arm the women that they work with to fight back and to, make systemic change happen.
Okay, so we have a question from the audience, which is actually for me. So here we go. Okay, hang on. Let me just type this first. All right, so I'm going to put Misty's question on air. So Missy asks, Anne Bishop has a lot of books. Yes, she has. Yes, Miss Bishop has a lot of books, beautifully written books. And so Missy wants to know which one I mentioned, and I'm going to show this. I mentioned the series called The Courtyard of the Others. It's a 5-book series. Try to get it. It's available everywhere. Just a trigger warning that it involves cutting. So it involves a race of women who cut in order to, and when the skin is cut, they can speak prophecy.
Wow.
So it may be triggering if you've done cutting as a teenager. So just to let everyone know this, but it is also really, really powerful. It touches on a lot of things, everything from the environment to violence against women to racism. And Ms. Bishop wraps it all up beautifully in some very gorgeous world building and storytelling. And bonus is slow burn romance. So slow burn that you can get 5 books, and at the end you're cheering for them. And there's no, that if anyone's concerned that I think it's also suitable for teenagers to read, even though the issues are tough. There's no there's no sex. Well, there's not a lot of sex in it at all. A lot of it's focused on all the issues that we've been talking about in this session. So, all right. So, yes, Misty, Written in Red is the first book. So go get it. Meg is the protagonist, and she is a very unusual protagonist. I guarantee that 100%. All right. So, book recommendations aside, so let's get back to our discussion. So geek culture, so we've been talking about Game of Thrones, we've talked about Black Panther, so let's talk a little bit more about that. Geek culture in general, including science fiction and fantasy, has had its share of critics, saying that it's still too male-dominated despite a rising number of prominent and well-respected and well-known female authors and creators. There is also still plenty of hostile, misogynist, and sexist behavior by male geeks towards female geeks and also anyone who is non-male. So what do you think needs to be done to make geek culture as a whole, whether it's comics or gaming or books, more welcoming for women and girls and non-male people?
I think that part of it is everyone needs to step up, and especially men need to step up. I think that for years, women and people of color have been sounding the alarm about toxic masculinity and racism and white supremacy in geek communities, and that's important and powerful and has had a huge impact. But I think that a lot of men still think that it's okay to have, to advance these problematic things, and a lot of that is because they are surrounded by other men who think the same and who tell them, who say the same thing, or who at the very least don't challenge them. So I think that this is where men need to stand up and to say, that's not okay, dude. Like that's, I think that it's like we've come a long way in terms of what is okay and what people say and what spaces, like a lot of spaces have really cleaned house. Like I'm a member of the Science Fiction Writers of America, which is a really great organization of writers of science fiction and fantasy and horror. And there's been this sort of like over the past several years, there's been a lot of like really big battles of bad behavior by members of the organization that was not like, no, you can't say that, you can't do that, people being checked. And now the it's not fixed 100%, but the overall discourse has evolved a lot. And so I think that the more people, including / especially men, stand up and tell people who advance these anti-woman ideas that are hostile to anyone who's not a man or a male, then that's going to really help. Unfortunately, a lot of these jerks only don't listen to, they think it's okay to make fun of XYZ community, and they don't really listen to them. And so it's really the when the slap upside the head comes, it has to come from the people who or it helps if it comes from the folks that they are programmed to respect or listen to.
Yeah, they are really they are getting really aggressive though lately. I mean,
Yeah.
any female centered movie or remake that centers women, just like Ghostbusters, for example, a few years ago, it just gets slapped down so hard. They literally spend all their time on YouTube just downvoting it. And it's like we one of our Read for Pixels authors, Stephen Graham Jones, he said we have to keep repeating the message.
Yeah.
Pop culture is not pie. You don't run out of it. Everybody can have, everybody should be welcome. It's not a scarcity model. It's everybody should be welcome.
Stephen is one of my favorites. I adore him. His new book, The Only Good Indians, is brilliant. But that's a great point that you bring up, because I think that a huge problem and a huge thing that needs to change is that the platforms like YouTube, like Facebook, like Twitter, like Instagram need to do a much better job of holding people accountable for their racism and their misogyny. And there is such a problem with this kind of bad behavior. I am part of this. I'm supporting, my husband is a nurse practitioner, and he's part of a collective of healthcare providers who are providing free healthcare to low-income folks and uninsured folks in Brooklyn. And we were promoting it on Instagram, and we used the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and somebody commented, "Only white lives matter." And so I reported them for hate speech, and Instagram wrote back to say, this doesn't violate our community standards. And so I think that while I know that there's a bit, many of these platforms are trying to figure it out, they have not figured it out, and they are not, like, to me, if you are advancing hate speech, you should be blocked, you should be banned, your account should be canceled. And that should happen okay, so you create a new account. Like, if that keeps happening, if YouTube would make it so that people like that suffer the consequences, then I think we start to see behavior shift. So I think a lot of it has to do with us holding the platforms accountable and forcing them to come up with real solutions, so that jerk on YouTube who keeps saying hateful, misogynist things about the female Ghostbusters doesn't have that platform to advance his hate speech.
Yeah, and speaking as a feminist and a women's human rights activists. We've noticed in recent years it's been intensifying. Women are getting locked out. Anyone who complains about toxic masculinity and misogyny is being locked out. We can't even say, pardon my language, but we can't even say men are trash without being given a warning from the system saying that we are going to be in Facebook jail for for 30 days or banned altogether. But then all these men who come in and say all these horrible, horrific things to women and non-men, they're allowed because it doesn't violate our community standards.
You're right. It's a huge problem. And I think it's like a bigger problem that we're seeing certainly in the United States and unfortunately globally, where the jerks are in power. The jerks feel empowered. They feel like they're driving the train. They feel like they are, in the White House. They are everywhere. They feel, you're right. I don't mean to say that the problem is going away. I mean that in many spaces there is progress being made, but in many more spaces it's a huge problem and it's getting worse, and it's really a terrifying, I think it's a terrifying moment. I think that, I don't know what's going to happen next in the US or in other countries, but it's a very, this is one of those moments that we read about in history books where it's like, this could go really badly.
When Ruth Bader Ginsburg died a week ago, we were all really shocked, and then all of us were really scared because, with women's human rights, whatever happens, it's unfortunate, but whatever happens in the US tends to ripple out to the rest of the world. I mean, when, I'm not going to say his name,
Please
the
don't.
White House got elected, immediately, we get all these reports going, on social media and all going, I just got, some guy just grabbed me, my private parts in public, or, and there are guys who actually are men on Twitter all going, now we can go, grab him by the, the P word. And you're like, you know what, this is going to be a really bad 4 years. And when RBG passed away last week, we're like, oh no.
I've been dreading that headline for the past 3.5 years. It's so horrible.
And that person, that monster, that whatever in the White House announced her replacement, and her replacement is one of those women who, like Phyllis Schlafly, would throw the rest of women, everyone else, under the bus.
Yeah.
Everyone else is gonna go under the bus, and I am going to go on a full rant. We don't have time for that.
That'll be. We'll schedule another session for that.
Yeah, we'll do another rant. So let's get to final 2 questions. And you have been so very incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. This is a Captain Obvious question, but why do you support the cause to end violence against women? We ask this of all our authors.
I think that violence against women is one of those issues that is so fundamentally tied into so many other types of oppression. As a gay man, I feel like I dealt with homophobic violence a lot throughout my life, especially when I was younger. And the same sort of attitude of the macho violence that the gay people face, where gay people are murdered, gay people are beat up, and often get away with it, right? I mean, there's this idea that this homosexual panic defense of you can murder a gay person, and if you claim in court that they made a pass at you, tons of killers of gay men have gotten off, have been acquitted because of that defense of oh my God, I was so scared. So this idea of masculinity as violent, to me is at the heart of so many of the problems we face. And it's the same problem. It's the same thing that put that monster in the White House. It's this idea that men can do whatever they want, and it's this old-fashioned idea of masculinity as a toxic, brutal thing. And so it's impossible for me to imagine queer liberation without women's liberation, without an end to violence against women. So this isn't an issue that just impacts women. It's an issue that impacts everybody, and that everybody is impacted by. And that, like I said, I worked on homelessness for 15 years, and so many people, so many women who experience homelessness, it's because of violence against women, or it's because of the patriarchy and the violence of the system. So to me, this is not a women's issue. This is an issue that impacts everybody. All of our liberation is tied up together. James Baldwin talked about, like, Black liberation in America is not about Black people. It's about everyone. It's about all of us are enslaved by racism. We are all broken and harmed by it. And until we can, white people are not free until, as long as there's racism in America, we are all, morally compromised. We are all living a lie. So all oppression is interlinked. And so violence against women is something that we all have to be committed to fight. It's in our own self-interest, even if we don't think of it, even if we don't see it that way. I think it is.
Okay. And the final question, what do you think authors can do to help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls?
I mean, I think that I, as a writer and as a storyteller, really want to say that storytelling is the most important, and that we want to tell the stories where that, maybe that doesn't exist at all. Maybe we want to imagine a world where that doesn't happen, and maybe to show that it's possible, to say, like, here's how a society might function if violence against women wasn't a thing, or to say, like, here's a story about violence against women. Let me tell it in a way that's fresh and powerful and compelling, and that doesn't exploit tropes in problematic ways. So yeah, there's a lot of ways in which writers can, through their art, fight violence against women. But I also think it's important for writers to not just rely on their art. And every writer who cares about this issue, I think, should also be an activist, should also be fighting, should also be calling their elected officials and marching in the streets, and calling out bad behavior on Twitter, and all the things that we do. It's easy to feel overwhelmed and powerless. Like you said, this is a scary time. It's getting scarier. The lunatics are driving the car, and they're driving it off a cliff. But so it's easy to feel helpless and powerless, but we do have a lot of power. We do have a lot of, ability to engage and fight for change, not just in our work, but in the world we live in and the countries that we live in.
Okay, and quick reminder, if you're going on a march, remember to wear your mask.
Wear your mask. Not marching isn't for everybody, and so if you're immunocompromised, if you are, there's lots of reasons why maybe you don't need to be in a march, but there's lots of other roles in a protest. Like, I always tell people, like, a lot of the folks that we work with have criminal records where they can't risk arrest, so they are the ones who stay in the office and call and do the phone banking to the media to get them to come out. Or they're the ones who, like, if there are arrests, they're the ones who call the emergency contacts to be like, hey, your husband got locked up in this protest, he's at this whatever. There's lots of ways to fight for change that don't involve being in the streets, but I'm a big fan of being in the streets, so if you can, you should.
All right. So I'm going to put myself back on screen. Hi, everybody. If you joined us late, I am the disembodied voice speaking to Sam behind the scenes. So we are going to wrap up now. So before we do that, let's talk about Sam's goodies. So Sam has generously donated some awesome goodies to the stash of treats that we have up as perks for US-based donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page, including signed and personalized first edition hardcovers of Destroy All Monsters, which Sam was reading from at the beginning of this session. There are only 7 copies of this book that Sam has made available for donors. For this particular goodie, well, 6 now, because Sarah Gaida, one of our longtime donors, has donated to book her book.
Thank you, Sarah.
And Sam won't just personalize a copy with some kind words. He's also going to hand draw you your choice of dinosaur as part of making the book uniquely for you. So you can choose any type of dinosaur you want.
I'm not a good artist, but I like drawing dinosaurs.
Yeah, and dinosaurs are cool. So the goodie number 2 is Sam put together a Destroy All Monsters book and art bundle. So that includes the signed and personalized edition hardcover of Destroy All Monsters, which of course will include the dinosaur. And he will also include one original digital illustration of a cartoon of an animal of the donor's choice. You could have another dinosaur, or you could have your dog or a cat or a gerbil, up to you. Sam will draw it. And maybe drinking tea, or maybe protesting with a little sign, like the dinosaur that he just showed us. And also, Sam will write one handwritten letter that's only for the donor's eyes. Now, we've suggested at the beginning that this might be a really, really great gift bundle to donate to get for your teenager, especially if your teenager is LGBTQIA. This is a really tough time for everybody, so it might help young people to hear from someone that they admire, from an author. Yeah, so go to our Rally Up fundraising page and have a look and see what you like. There are only 3 of these exclusive bundles available. So once they're gone, you're gone. And we have plenty more author goodies available from folks including Alex Segura, Kelly Garrett, Matt Gardiner, RJ Barker, Tamora Pierce, Alwyn Hamilton, Marsha Ryan Maresca, Maria Lewis, and more. And I'm going to put up a screen. I'm going to share a screen to show you where to go get the goodies. All right, you can donate to get these goodies on Rally Up. Go to http://bit.ly/R4P Rally Up 2020. It's case sensitive, everybody. So make sure to take it down exactly. Otherwise, you end up with this page does not exist, which is not good. So take it down exactly. And Xiaoqin is also has also put the link in the comments, the chat box on YouTube, so you can click to go from there. You can also find out more about the Read for Pixels program that this event is part of by going to bit.ly/readforpixels. And if you want to find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it, please visit the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. We actually have a section where you click on it, I think it's called resources. If you click on it, it's called About Violence Against Women. You click on it, there are starter pages that are starters, 101s for everything from domestic violence to murdered and missing Indigenous women. Now, we mentioned Rebecca Roanhorse earlier in the session, and during Rebecca's session, which you can find on our YouTube playlist for Read for Pixels, we talk about murdered and missing Indigenous women, which is a really huge issue within the movement of violence against women. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Before we say goodbye, Sam, I think you have an announcement to make, yeah?
Not much of one, just that my 4th novel, The Blade Between, comes out in December. It's a horror novel, like a crime thriller, about gentrification and whale ghosts. Comes out.
Whale ghosts?
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm gonna look it up. So anyway, we need to say goodbye to everybody now. So everyone, thank you for attending our Read for Pixels campaign this September. This is actually the last session. So thank you all for your support. Please give generously if you can before we're going into Domestic Violence Awareness Month this October. So if you can, please give what you can to our fundraiser. We need to try to reach 5K by 18th of October. So everyone, have a good day or good night wherever you are in the world.
Thank you, everyone.